Alright, so today we're going to talk about protection of personnel. This is employees, other radiation workers, not only those that come over from ortho, but sometimes the doctors that you do surgeries with, all the staff in there, head nurses, anesthesiologists, everybody else. Annual effective dose, 5 rem, you've heard over and over. This is for routine operations. 0.1 has been the establishment for individuals in the general population. If you look at your film badge readings, generally you're maybe closer to 0.1 rem than anything else. You're never going to approach 5 rem unless your badge gets locked into the OR room or stuck to the bottom of a C-arm, and even that would take quite a while to reach. Because continual use of radiation protection awareness procedures ensures a high degree of safety for most radiation exposures, radiography is not considered a hazardous profession. So remember that for the ART, because it is considered a very safe profession, even safer than nursing because of the potential for needle sticks, all the airborne viruses, close proximity to patients. So generally it is a very safe field. Cumulative effective dose, basically with this we're just going to multiply the tech's age times 10 millisieverts to get the CED. If you're asking for it in rem, then basically the age that you are, that's the most cumulative effective dose that you could have. This is just a case study talking about ALARA. This is a CT exam where too many scans were done on a particular child. If something like this happens, generally the technologist is going to be fired and potentially lose their license. If you read the bottom here, the parents suing the hospital for the amount of exposures, which is considered super excessive, was done because you're not paying attention to dose limits. Reducing scatter reduces the occupational hazard for the tech. So you want to use your collimators, you want to use close collimation, you want to aim the tube a certain particular way to keep it away from the control booth. Correct use of protective apparel and reduction in repeat exams also reduces the amount of scatter radiation to you, the technologist. So the more skilled you are, the less radiation that you are going to receive. There are, of course, bad habits that you'll see with techs holding patients constantly. Should be able to use sponges, proper instructions, angling the tube. Try to minimize the amount of times that you have to hold your patients. Pregnant radiographers are going to wear an additional monitoring device at waist level to ensure monthly equivalent dose does not exceed 0.5 millisieverts. Okay? This number is not an annual dose. This is based on the 9-month pregnancy. So what you have is you usually have a separate badge right here with a little baby in the shadow instead of a regular badge that you will still wear. This one at collar level. This one will be worn at waist level beneath the apron if you happen to be doing fluoro or C-arms or something where you have to put a shield on. So with this, there's some protective tube housing that must be used to protect the radiographer and the patient from all leakage radiation going across here. Secondary control barrier is going to be, or control booth barrier is going to be the secondary protective barrier. Window needs to have at least 1.5 millimeters of lead equivalent to keep the exposure to 1 millisievert per week. But most rooms are well designed these days that you only get 0.02 millisieverts per week. Doors have been moved to different areas. The buckies aren't typically next to the control room, they're across the room. So the general exposure you receive nowadays with facilities working towards minimizing dose is much, much less than it used to be. Protection during routine fluoro. Radiographer, in addition to wearing protective apparel, should stand as far away from the patient as practical and move closer when assistance is required. So if you have to stay in the room for a BE, just stand off to the side as the doctor is kind of looking at the anatomy while fluoroing. Otherwise, when they want you to turn the patient or move things like the bag, then you can move in, move it, and then step back again. This shows you where you should stand. You can read this through. It kind of gives you a description of the best places to stand. But if you remember this, standing at 90-degree angle to the primary beam at a distance of 1 meter, so it's about 3 feet. Scatter radiation is about 1/1000th the intensity of the primary beam. So instead of being right here, if you're just 3 feet away and at a 90-degree angle behind this protective curtain, bucky slot shield, about 1/1000th the intensity. If you take a further step back, a little bit more than 1 meter, then the inverse square law comes in and actually drops quite a bit more. Fluoroscope. Department should be rotating techs through all areas, and no single person's in the same area each week. So if you're in the OR and fluoro with every rotation, then that's not quite right. We want to rotate the techs around so that the amount of radiation is kind of dispersed through all the employees and not just one or two particular employees. Bucky slot shield that reduces gonad ghost is going to be by the IR. Protective curtain to reduce torso dose, that's basically the drape that hangs down. Image intensifier as close to the patient as possible, especially with C-arm fluoro. Portables, just wear protective aprons, stand at least 6 feet away from the patient, the tube, and the useful beam. If you stand at a right angle, like you see here, obviously you're going to avoid the direct exposure going across. Generally, you do not have to wear gowns when you are doing portables, unless you happen to have to hold the patient or very close to the patient. 3 basic principles of radiation protection: time, distance, and shielding. I'll kind of go over this quite a bit over the entire 2 years. That racket you hear is a doggy rolling around the floor right now. Distance, most effective means of protection from ionizing radiation. So the further away you are from the radiation, obviously the better. Of the 3, it's probably the most important. Lead apron, at least 0.25 millimeters lead equivalent thickness should be worn. It can be up to 0.5, commonly in California. We want to basically make sure that our aprons stay in good shape. If you do the fluoro test once a year like you're supposed to, you're going to notice that some of these cracks develop within the lead of the aprons, and obviously it could be hazardous to the patient, or not the patient, but the employee. So we want to make sure that these gowns are being hung properly. They should be hung on a stand that basically hangs from the shoulder area. We don't want them to fold over, because if you fold them over, generally over time they will develop cracks in them, which means we have to throw them away at a cost to our department. Never stand in the primary beam to hold the patient during an X-ray procedure. Stand to the side. So page 325 actually shows that pretty well. This is because we do not want to get hit by primary radiation, and we also do not want the parents or people that are helping us to be hit by primary radiation. So if you think about it, basically if you had a patient, like a little child that you're doing a chest X-ray on the table and the kid is sitting up, we don't want the parent right behind them with the kid's chest here and the IR in between them. So we want to make sure that they stay out of the primary beam. They should be standing just kind of off to the side so we can still get our picture, and we want to make sure that there's no rotation involved with that. And of course they should have some lead on. Protective eyeglasses, up to 0.5 millimeter lead equivalent should be used when looking directly at the source of radiation. So these are common in fluoro, sometimes in IR, where there's a higher dose of fluoro going on. You want to make sure that the glasses are pointing straight ahead towards the IR surface, because a lot of times you'll turn around, grab something, and then turn back. It has the potential that, if radiation's in the room, you go from the back, skimming your head, and then go back into the glasses, thus hitting the lens of the eye, which is not that common, but it is a general safety feature that we should be aware of. Thyroid shields must be minimum of 0.5 millimeter lead equivalent as well. A lot of times these are attached to the lead aprons or gowns that we have on there. It can offer further protection to the thyroid because it is a sensitive organ, some more so in other patients, so we want to protect that as much as possible. Some patients are generally aware that they have thyroid problems, or maybe they're just uninformed about the effects of radiation. But in the past, if a patient asks for it, I will give them a thyroid shield if it doesn't interfere with the exam. It sits typically at T3, T4, just above the jugular notch here, so up to T2, between T4. So as long as you know where it is, it's much easier to cover it up. Occupancy factor, workload, and use factor must be considered when determining thickness requirements for protective barrier. So how the room is constructed is based on how much is this room going to be used, how many patients you're going to be doing, how many hours is it on per day, and they take all those calculations to figure out how much thickness shielding is required. So workload, radiation output weighted time during the week that the unit is actually delivering radiation. So we're looking at this, we're going to measure it in MAS per week or MA minutes per week. kVp is not used in this calculation at all. It's just the amount of work that we're doing within a particular room. Use factor. Use factor goes into the structures in the room are all hit by radiation to some degree. So what we'll have is if the upright bucket is used for half of the exams, like half your exams are chest, C-spines, upright abdomens, ribs, then the U primary is going to be at 1/2. U secondary is always 1, so multiplying times 1 is always easy. But if we're asking between, how much is the upright bucket versus the table bucket being used, then we can split those into 1/2 terms, or sometimes 1/3 if we're dividing the 3 between tabletop as well. Radiation barriers are installed to protect personnel and general public from radiation from otherwise would reach them uninhibited. So occupancy factor goes into modifying the shielding requirements for a particular barrier by taking into account the fraction of the work week that the space beyond the barrier is occupied. So space beyond the barrier, talking about outside the room with the hallways on the other side of those walls, that makes a difference as well. And I kind of measure that off to determine how much shielding requirements for each room is needed. Let's see, for each wall, door, or other barrier in an X-ray room that is provide protection against radiation, the product of work usage occupancy factor must be determined. So basically you multiply those 3 things together. Controlled area, this is just a region adjacent to a wall of an X-ray room that is used only by occupational exposed personnel. So this would be the room, the control area where the actual exposure button is, as well as the monitor and such. Uncontrolled areas, nearby hall or corridor that's frequented by the general public. So that's going to be usually the hall just outside, going this way, where there is an X-ray room, but there's people walking by the hallway on the opposite side. Thermography, since 2 potentials are less than 50 kVp, only need 0.5 millimeters of aluminum. It's just less power, so you don't need as much shielding requirements. Primary and secondary protective barriers must be designed to ensure annual effective dose limits are not exceeded. Well, obviously, we want to make sure we keep our employees safe and we stay within that 5 rem limit. Primary protective barriers located perpendicular to the line of travel of the primary X-ray beams. They are a direct line of the primary radiation. 1.5 millimeter lead is required for a normal diagnostic range. So that's the amount of, generally, like if you look here with the primary beam going towards this bucket, this wall has to have 1.5 millimeters of lead. They also need to be at least 7 feet high and have 1/16 lead within the walls to kind of protect this whole area from off-focus radiation as well. Secondary protective barriers protect against secondary radiation, which is basically leakage and scatter radiation. Any wall barrier that is never struck by primary X-ray beam is a secondary barrier. So if we look at this little window that we're kind of looking through, that would be considered a secondary protective barrier because we do not aim this towards the window at all. This is a 1/32 lead sheet within this wall here is what would generally be used. Housing must be constructed so leakage radiation measured at a distance of 1 meter away does not exceed 100 MR. That's just another point that we mentioned in a previous PowerPoint. Inverse square law. If you do not know the inverse square law by now, it's probably too late for you. But if you have questions about it, I can certainly answer that for you. But you should be able to do this inverse square law almost in your head if the numbers are pretty simple. So doubling the distance, 1/4 of the exposure, tripling the distance, 1/9 the original exposure. So in these questions on the ART, you should be able to answer them very quickly since it is a multiple choice answer, and eliminate basically 2 answers that are going the wrong way. And then the other 2, you should be able to narrow down based on going by 1/3 and then another third, or going by 1/2 and then going by another half to get to 1/4 on there. So if you have questions on that, I can certainly help answer those for you. This just shows representative what the actual inverse square law is again, so make sure you know how to plug in those numbers. And that concludes the protection for the personnel. So important chapter to kind of go over. Make sure you fill in the rest of the chapter by reading it through, because it can certainly make a little bit more sense to you because it's something you will use on a kind of a day-to-day basis or should be a little bit more aware of as a technologist. Thank you.